Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special live stream. Today, we've got none other than Jarek Beeson, who is the CISO of Commercial Bank at Capital One. Prior to that, he was the CISO and SVP at Epic, and he's also the host of our own SANS Institute's Seat at the Table show. Now, of course, I'm Frank Kim from the SANS Institute, so Jarek, just want to welcome you to the show.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, Jarek, we're turning the tables a little bit here today. As I just mentioned, hey, you're the host of a podcast and the Seat at the Table show. And, we wanted to flip the script here a little bit and put you in the hot seat and talk a little bit about cloud security. We're supposed to be talking today about the enterprise journey to multi-cloud security. And I know you've got a lot of experience with this. When we first met, it was because of the SANS CloudSec Next event where you were speaking all about cloud security and various best practices. Now, in your time here as a CISO at various organizations, the changes in the landscape that we've seen over the last few years, what have you been seeing from a multi-cloud and enterprise multi-cloud security perspective?
I'm seeing that there are two schools of thought. One group thinks that multi-cloud is the best way to go. It addresses a lot of the concerns with the cloud. For example, if one provider goes down, you can leverage the other provider. You can even put them against each other from a cost savings perspective. But then there's another school of thought that you stick with one cloud and one cloud only because learning cloud is hard enough. And trying to learn more than one is in some cases an insurmountable task. But I don't know that either one has won the race, but there are definitely two schools of thought.
Excellent points. And I've seen the vast majority of large organizations, enterprises are multi-cloud either by choice or by chance, just by accident, via acquisition, different business units, and so on. And typically, as we know, there's one security team, but now you mentioned it's hard to learn about, well, what do we have to do to secure all of these different clouds? Is how do you think about going and developing your talent pool, your team's cloud security expertise, especially with this diverse set of tools and services that we've got to be familiar with?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a loaded question. You made up a good point, right? Some people are leveraging the cloud because uh, there's multiple different clouds because they have to, and in some cases, the vendors strong arm them to do so. And in other cases, people are doing it because each provider provides a different type of specialization. Another use case is for disaster recovery purposes. Like I said, you want to be able to make sure you're always available. And generally, understanding the why for the multi cloud will inform your strategy. I'll give you a good example. GCP is one of the best known for its past capabilities when it comes to machine learning, big data products, and data analytics. It's important to know that because those are likely the services that your company is going to be leveraging if they do decide to leverage or use GCP. And the way you approach and secure those services looks a little bit different than how you may manage a managed Kubernetes instance inside of Azure, as another example. So there are some parallels across all the platforms, but each one specializes in something. And understanding that and your company's use cases is the very, very beginning to developing your strategy, developing your talent pool, and all of the controls that you're going to put in place.
You mentioned a number of key points in terms of the why, the strategy, the business objectives. A lot of times, I started my career as a technical person, when buried in the weeds, sometimes we might tend to forget the overarching business reasons why we're trying to actually accomplish something. The technology is kind of a side effect or, an enabler here. And I've been talking to dozens of different organizations, and I was talking to one large Fortune 100 organization not too long ago, and they are multi-cloud, kind of by accident in all three major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP. And they said, one of our biggest challenges is that, especially from a SOC, from a security monitoring perspective, we tried to, over the years, build up our SIM, aggregate data into the SIM itself for one central place where we can go and analyze different events. And they said, you know what, Frank, it's too much. There's too much data in the cloud for us to put all of that into the SIM. So we've had to currently resort to using the various cloud provider tools and services to try to figure out what's going on. Is how do what do you suggest? What do you recommend in this case where you've got this overwhelming mountain of data that the SOC now has to sift through?
Yeah, so I've seen this done a few different ways. more and more, I have actually seen a cloud SOC, which is a SOC dedicated just to the cloud data, the cloud infrastructure, cloud workloads. Another thing that I'm also seeing, which is no different than any other SIM, is actually normalizing the data, filtering the data, and leveraging what the cloud providers are offering, which is a level of threat intel and threat management, to identify the true events that need to be moved over to the SIM. So back in the day when Sims first came out, we just sent all of our data. And then data got bigger and bigger and bigger. And that doesn't work on premise, and it definitely is not going to work in the cloud. In fact, in the cloud, you're creating more data. So identify the data that needs to go, centralize it, normalize it, condition it, and then pass on the relevant data to your SIM. And then you can have a more efficient and a more sustainable architecture.
Hmm. Oh, you mentioned another keyword there in terms of architecture. And, one of the things that, I've seen is sometimes people will say, cloud providers will say, oh, just stream the data, use, let's say Kinesis streams or something, stream it to wherever you want to get to. But depending on the volume of data, you might incur more costs than you might actually expect. From an architecture perspective, how do you think about those trade-offs and those balances?
Yeah, so one of the hidden things that people don't talk about in the security community, but definitely in the IT and ops community, is ingress and egress charges are that hidden cost that you find out at the end of the month. And you don't want to be surprised by those. And you definitely don't want security to be the reason why, the price went up 30, 40, 50%. So
Mhm.
what I typically do is I will aggregate all the logs in a single location within that cloud provider, so that way it never has to leave that cloud provider. And then what gets sent out from that cloud provider is specifically what needs to be sent out. If you have a direct connection or a tunnel directly to your data center, it's even cheaper. So you don't have to go over the internet. But ultimately, make all the decisions within that cloud provider as to what's going to go out so you can minimize how much data has to egress from your environment.
Great point. Muhammad has a really good comment here is each cloud seems to be providing a specialty in one domain over the other. Earlier, just moments ago, you mentioned, well, what are the business drivers? What are the objectives? And, how would you summarize is, what are the three major cloud providers? Kind of what's the big benefit or what are the common use cases that you've seen organizations moving to one cloud provider versus the other versus the kind of, hey, the sales team doing a good job and taking the right people out to dinner and play golf?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in GCP. I'll put that out there now, but I've done a little bit of analysis. Number one, big data, machine learning, those products, that's what they came out the gate with. They have a pricing model that's by the minute, I believe, versus by the hour. So when you have those ephemeral instances, it's going to cost you less in a GCP environment. And a lot of it is PaaS, not as much IaaS. When you move over to your AWS, EC2 is the bread and butter. AWS has been around for a lot longer. They have a lot more features, more bells and whistles, and it's more about the compute. And then when you look at Azure, Azure is an extension of what we've been doing in data centers for so long. SQL as a service, leveraging Azure to support your O365 environment, and so forth. Now, it provides IaaS just as much as AWS does, just as much as GCP does. But when you think about the things that people know them for, that's what they're known for.
Excellent. The it's interesting that you mentioned that. Hey, this is I don't know if you guys can hear. I have noise canceling software on, and I've just got a little bit of an interruption here. So, Jarek, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what you see between Azure and GCP here while I deal with this little emergency here.
No problem. So one of the things that I think about when I'm building out a strategy for a team and is identifying the talent. So people look at technology as one of the most challenging aspects of the multi-cloud journey, but for me it's developing and identifying and keeping the talent. It's hard to find a cyber expert in any one of the cloud providers. GCP is probably the hardest because it's still the newest and it doesn't get as much publicity as AWS or Microsoft does. That's starting to change, but they started a little bit later, right? Try finding someone that has two of those cloud providers and you're looking for a very expensive unicorn. And looking for all three is all but impossible. And if you do find them, they're an extremely expensive unicorn that like poofs rainbows or something, right? So there those people just aren't out there. So you have to take more of a build versus buy approach. There are recs all over the place and job openings all over the place, but more and more companies are realizing they have to build out these teams. And what you have to do, if you're fortunate enough to recruit one, is try to keep them, and that's hard as well. So part of the multi-cloud security strategy should include identifying who your experts are going to be on each platform. If you have a team of, let's say, 6 engineers, you can't have all 6 of them take all the trainings across all the platforms. None of them will become a specialist in any one of them, and you want to be great in as many places as possible. But then additionally, keep in mind you're going to be building unicorns, right? So the people that you can't find, you're going to build them, and then other people are going to want them. So it's important that you build succession planning as well. Of course, all the other things you do to retain talent, you want to do that. But the reality is, you're going to make them attractive to the market, and you won't be able to keep all of them. So you got to have a steady pipeline, and hiring junior talent, hiring talent that's not as experienced will at least give you 3 or 4 years with them, which is kind of ideal at this point for junior talent. But it'll allow you to sustain and have specific focal areas for each one. I brought up, the GCP example of big data. If you find someone that learns about the various different big data platforms, that learns about the different data analytics and the different algorithms and machine learning capabilities, that person can specialize in your GCP environment. That doesn't mean they don't know the other stuff, but if you have any challenges, any architecture decisions, whatever it may be, that's your person. And you want to be able to have something similar across all your providers. Divide and conquer is the only way I've seen it work. You can't have your team kind of spread across all of them.
Yeah, great points. Really love that approach of divide and conquer. Don't send everybody to all of the exact training. There's this concept of a full stack engineer that's been around for a long time. And in most enterprises I've seen, it's kind of hard to have a team of all full stack engineers that know a little bit about everything. So this suggestion about specializing is really good and starting young. You might want to, especially in cloud, if you look across your security portfolio, cloud especially is an area where you might want to overhire, knowing that the demands are going to rise, knowing that there's naturally going to be some attrition as people move on in their careers. Now, here we're talking about getting ready for multi-cloud, and with organizations on this journey to improving their multi-cloud security, well, one of the things that people look to is, well, what about the non-cloud service provider? What about the various vendor solutions? So in these vendor solutions naturally, advertise themselves as being multi-cloud. There's a whole slew alphabet soup of acronyms that describe various cloud security tools. One of the most popular, commonly utilized now are the CSPMs, the Cloud Security Posture Management Solutions. And they've gone through different iterations, evolutions from when they first came out a few years ago to now. What I like to refer to as the first generation and the next generation. Jarek, what have you seen? What do you recommend in terms of these third-party solutions? And part of this, I mentioned you're currently at Capital One. Capital One has one of the leading free open source, if you will, cloud security posture management tools in Cloud Custodian that also has multi-cloud support. How do you think about this from a tooling perspective, product perspective, but also a commercial and an open source perspective?
Well, I won't speak specifically on Capital One for 2 reasons. 1, didn't get permission to, and 2, we actually are focused on a singular cloud. We are all in on AWS, so it doesn't fit this multi-cloud narrative. But I will say is Microsoft is actually providing a CSPM, though they don't call it a CSPM. All the features of your typical CSPM they offer through their security center and defender capabilities. So you don't actually have to go third party in all cases. But if for whatever reason you don't go Microsoft, the value of those types of solutions is, number one, it helps you manage the largest risk, and the largest risk for any cloud environment is misconfiguration. At the end of the day, um, any analyst you speak with will tell you that misconfiguration is what leads to the majority of data breaches, and misconfiguration that's not detected is also kind of problematic when it comes to that. So what you really want to do is You want to identify what matters to you, what are the controls, what are the things that you want to see across all of your cloud environments. You want to define them at an outcome level. Outcomes being we want to use MFA, we want to make sure that certain storages are not allowed to be visible externally, whether it be Blob or Google Storage or S3. It's all the same at the high level outcome. And then you bring in your CSPM tool to govern that, and in some cases enforce that. And why this is important is you can go do this individually within Google. You can do this individually within AWS. You can do this individually within Azure, but that's going to take more time and it's going to use more of your human capital. And the idea here is to do things as efficiently as possible and do them with the speed of the cloud. One of the things that the cloud offers the ability to do is automate. One of the things the cloud offers you the ability to do is take a lot of compute and do something in a very short period of time. So I say identify a solution that works across all your providers, identify the outcomes that you want, and then how those outcomes will get executed will be different across each provider, but you can govern them all inside of a tool like a CSPM solution.
Awesome. Outstanding advice. I really love the focus on the outcomes versus the details of the specific implementation. Really reminds me of in the industry we've been talking about for years, this whole gates versus guardrails concept. And it used to be we in security would go to the DevOps team and say, no, this is how you have to do it. You must use this tool. We've seen that not work so well over the years, and instead change the conversation of, hey, this is the outcome we're looking for. How do you think we might be able to get there? Applies not just to DevOps, not just to the cloud, but hey, to the security program overall. Now,
Uh,
Mohammed has, oh, go ahead, Jared.
No, say I agree, right? So, like, if I were to double tap on the outcomes, your policy is the outcome, maybe even your standards are the outcome, and those policies and standards should be cloud agnostic. MFA, microsegmentation, encryption by rest, traffic routing, all those things do not necessarily need to be defined at the detail on how you're going to do it per cloud at the top level from a policy perspective. But then when you start looking at each provider, you want to define the how, but you also need someone that has a horizontal view to do as much as possible to make sure that they mirror each other as much as possible. So I'll give you an example. Using if you use AWS CloudFormation to build out a virtual private cloud, plan to use Azure Resource Manager to do the same thing in Azure, or plan to use Google Deployment Manager to do the same thing in GCP, right? Everywhere you go, there isn't an equivalent service across the different platforms, but there are services that are very similar to each other. And the last thing you want to do is do a task manually in one platform, automate it on another, and completely not do it at all on the different one. Your architectural patterns should look as similar as possible, and that only happens if you define the high level outcomes, and then the how kind of follows suit.
You just mentioned a number of key points again, reminding us of architecture, the architectural patterns. You mentioned Terraform and cloud formation, and this is a perfect segue into a question comment from Mohammed here is, well, what do you think, this idea of multi-cloud, what about an abstract layer where an offering can be implemented via Terraform and you give the consumer an option to choose? Is that a possibility? Do you think that's something that's worth doing? Has anyone done anything like that already?
So I won't limit it to just Terraform, but yeah, multiple different vendors will tell you you can choose whatever cloud you want to choose. We have a Kubernetes container, we have a Docker container that's going to work in any one of these environments. The challenge when you take that approach and leveraging an abstract layer is you own more of the stack. So inside of the different providers, Azure, for example, offers a Kubernetes as a service. Well, if you're going to leverage their Kubernetes as a service, you're leveraging the entire Azure stack, and you may not be able to layer something on top of it. If someone's going to hand you a Docker image, you have to do all of it yourself. So there are pros and cons to it, but that flexibility is something that a lot of companies want. And if they have the skill set on their team to be able to build it all out, yeah, that might be an option for them.
Great. There's a specific question here on kind of learning the different clouds. You mentioned this earlier in terms of divide and conquer, not have everybody on your team take all of the same training, go through the same path. It's not so much talking about what specific offerings to take, but how do you kind of map that out for people on your team? Mentioned bringing on people that are perhaps earlier in their cloud security journey. What do you recommend to people on your team? How do you kind of lay that out? Is where do they start, and what are the types of things that you want them to focus on through their learning journey?
So each cloud provider has done an over the top job of creating certification programs. Number one, it just creates more of a following on their platforms. But also, the better you know the platforms, the more likely you are to recommend the platform, the more likely you are to want to be engaged in the platform. So each one gives you multiple different steps, and I won't name them all because I honestly don't remember them. But in general, there's a entry level type of certification, and then they go all the way up to architect, in many different cases, or the equivalent of an architect. And I would just follow that path. Leveraging, the SANS types of certifications and trainings, you're going to get more of a general view across the board. And that general view is going to be those outcomes that we talked about, right? So it may not give you specifics on how to do something in GCP, AWS, or Azure, but it's going to tell you what good looks like. And what good looks like will be done differently in each environment, but you got to know what that looks like first to even begin to start, configuring or coding within those platforms.
Great. A lot of good comments here in the chat. We got somebody from LinkedIn. I'm jumping around, switching topics here. Is it related to the different cloud providers? Well, what do you think about the CIS benchmarks as a way to evaluate your security posture across the different clouds?
Um, I like CIS benchmarks in general. I'm gonna go old school and talk about a CIS benchmark for Windows looks different than a CIS benchmark for Linux, even though it has some of the same expectations. The problem with the CIS benchmarks for me is depending on who's developed them, they seem to go in depth a little further on the stuff that's been around longer. So my personal experience is that what exists for, let's say, AWS is far more in depth on the CI's benchmarks than what I've seen in GCP. And that might just be because of the age of GCP as well as how GCP is leveraged. So I don't lean on any one benchmark, but I bring it all together and have a best practices guide for myself.
hmm All right. Excellent. Now, we've got another question here. It's which best practices should we deeply look into in terms of, well, here's the nut of the question here from Mohammed is, well, hey, how do you know if you have a good architecture or not? How do you know if your architecture needs updating? What are some signs? What are some indicators of that?
The cloud providers, once again, they give you the tools to be successful in their environments, as long as you're leveraging the services that have been around for a while. If they deployed a service, a couple months ago, even a year ago, you may not get the best advice on how to secure it. But for the stuff that's tried and true, they will give you the reference architectures that are most secure. And in some cases, they have entire trainings on those specific architectures. There are some things that are standard across the board, right? Where how do you want data to flow out? Do you want to make sure that it's not going directly to the internet, but it's going through another VPC where the traffic can be expected, or making sure that there's no direct access to any of your production instances. It depends if you're using a DevOps. If there's DevOps and there's this entire world of a DevOps pipeline and how that DevOps pipeline is going to be configured. Um, Segmenting as many of your services as possible. The list goes on, but once again, these are very generic. How you do them in every single environment is definitely going to be different.
That was a really good reminder in terms of the cloud providers have their various security reference architectures that have relatively recently been published. Actually, CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, also, which I haven't fully digested and read all of that yet, but they also published not too long ago their security reference architecture for the cloud. So a lot of good free resources that are available. I want to talk just a little bit about some other capabilities. You mentioned a couple times Kubernetes, containers, and so on. This is a foundational cloud native layer of everything that we're doing, deploying into the cloud service providers themselves. We mentioned CSPMs already. There's also another set of tools specifically around containers and Kubernetes in terms of securing those various solutions, commonly referred to as CWPP, Cloud Workload Protection Platforms. There's going to be a quiz on this later, everybody.
I
How do
might not pass it.
you, and then, of course, from a SaaS perspective, you've got your various CASBs, your cloud access security brokers. Taking a step back from kind of this category of tools, we didn't really talk specifically, I think, about kind of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. How do you think, Jarek, about your portfolio across IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS across your span of responsibility?
Yeah, so first thing I realize and I recognize is there's a shared responsibility model, and that responsibility model looks different across each one. When it comes to IaaS, you own everything but the hypervisor. The hypervisor is where the hardware is, and that's all by the provider, the data center that it's in, the arm guards that are outside, whatever it may be. And then as you start to move up the stack, you own more and more of the stack. Actually, I'm sorry, as you move up the stack, you own less and less of the stack. So from a PaaS perspective, you own the platform and up. And then as you start going to SaaS, you just own the data and the application configuration. And important to realize is there are some consistencies across the board. In all cases, you own data. In all cases, you own application configuration. In all cases, you own monitoring and detection. In all cases, you own encryption of the data. In all cases, you own privacy. Now, how much of it you're sharing with the provider, that varies primarily by the stack. All the providers that I've seen accept ownership at the same portions of the stack. It just looks a little bit differently depending on the service that they're offering.
Mhm. All right. Hey, we're getting close to the time that we have here. We do have a hard stop at half past, everybody. So, Jarek, I want to talk a little bit about from a CISO perspective, leadership perspective. Hey, CISOs, we got a hard job. You got to lead upwards to your senior executives. You got to lead horizontally with your peers. You got to lead downward, if you will, to your team. From a cloud security perspective, how do you tell that comprehensive story, both upwards, horizontally, downwards throughout the organization? Is what's worked for you in terms of being consistent across not just cloud, but your security program as a whole?
Yes, ultimately, as a CISO, your job is to enable the business to take risks. And if they decide to go in the cloud, that's a new type of risk. And the way you enable that business to take the risk is you help them identify and understand those risks and mitigate those risks. If they decided to operate in a data center, there's a whole other set of risks that we have to deal with. There's hardware risks that we don't have to care about in the cloud, right? Whatever we do, if we're going to operate on the internet, if we're going to plug a blue wire or connect any one of the different wireless protocols, there's going to be some level of risk, and my job is to help mitigate that. Now, the benefit of the cloud is I can mitigate that more efficiently and more expediently in some cases. I can leverage the power of the cloud and some of the services that are in the cloud to do things quicker and at a higher volume. I can scale up and scale down how I'm able to do certain things. So if there's a high performance time of the month, I can scale up my monitoring and add terabytes of storage. You can't do that in a data center type of environment. So there are definitely some benefits to it. But then I also have to manage the fact that we don't fully own all of security. So there's a level of trust that we're giving to our cloud providers. And that's just part of the risk that you accept by default once you leverage a cloud provider. Fortunately, the major cloud providers, they're doing their job. They are doing their part when it comes to it, and they have an intense amount of scrutiny when it comes to how they're performing security. Now, if like some guy named Joe comes out with his own IaaS platform, you have something to worry about with Joe's IaaS platform. But with the three big players, that shared risk, in many cases, you're probably more secure than you would be in your own data center.
hmm Hey, great reminder there that as security professionals, our job is to manage information risk, manage cyber risk for the organization. And the way that we typically do that is by implementing various security controls, using the cloud services, security services to develop and deploy more secure systems, but ultimately with the goal of managing risk more appropriately. So, Jarek, hey, I just want to thank you so much for all of the insights and knowledge that you've shared here with everybody that's been attending on this live stream. It's always great to speak with you and look forward to doing the next one. So, Jarek, thank you so much. Any last words before we close it out here?
Yep. You know what? Keep it simple, guys. It's about protect, detect, respond, and recover. No matter what the platform is, that's really what you're trying to accomplish. How you do it in the cloud is a little bit different than how you do it in a data center, but the goal is still the same.
Right on. Thank you very much. And just as the last item here, hey, we've been talking about multi-cloud security. If you're interested in learning more about multi-cloud security, we do have a SANS Cloud Security Exchange event coming up in August, August 25th. And on the stage, on the virtual stage, we are going to have representatives from both Google Cloud and Microsoft from Azure talking about, well, their best practices, what they see, other SANS speakers, other industry speakers at this event as well. This is completely free to attend. So if you enjoyed this session, please do think about joining us on August 25th as well at the SANS Cloud Security Exchange. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next time.